if any of you have any questions, that is the place to put them. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Fatima, and I am the CARE moderator for this legislative briefing. Essentially, this briefing is kind of going to cover the whole situation regarding Palestine and how it affects Marylanders. So since October 7th, Israel has been attacking Gaza at unprecedented levels. And this has shattered the lives of many people and resulted in the deaths of almost 30,000 people. Here in Maryland and across the United States, there's also been a surge in anti-Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab bias that's been reported in the US. These issues are very important to Marylanders because there are Marylanders who are Gazan American whose families have been victims of this crisis. And many people here have faced Islamophobia and anti briefing to provide state lawmakers with comprehensive information and insights into issues related to Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian hate, as well as the situation in Palestine, and to empower state lawmakers to make informed decisions, make sure that they're promoting tolerance and inclusivity, and to contribute to the development of fair and just policies. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. And coming here is just the first step. So we will urge you to consider the information that's going to be presented in the following hour and a half or so, and to support an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We also urge you to support unrestricted humanitarian aid into Gaza and to advocate for free speech protections, especially when it comes to the doxing of students and baseless attacks and retaliation against groups and individuals over Palestine advocacy. And lastly, we want lawmakers to oppose the bill seeking to remove CARE from the Attorney General Hate Crimes Commission. So with that being said, I'm going to briefly discuss the agenda for today. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go into a brief overview of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And then we're going to have our keynote speaker, Dr. Hatem Bazian. He's going to speak on the unprecedented levels of hate bias that's been seen recently and the rhetoric surrounding the events in Gaza. And then we're going to have two more wonderful speakers, Shelley Cohen Fudge and Dr. Philip Farah, who are both going to bring their own perspectives regarding the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the resulting anti-Muslim and anti-Arab rhetoric. And last but not least, we're then going to have kind of a discussion and Q&A to address any remaining questions that you all may have. So any sources that I will use in this briefing will be sent out in a follow-up email to everyone who registered for the briefing, just so you all have access to these notes and understand where these things are coming from, and if you all want to do any further reading. So the first thing we're going to look at is kind of an overview of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So first thing, we're going to look at the impact on children. So as I mentioned, in total, there have been almost 30,000 people killed in Gaza. 67% of these deaths are the deaths of women and children. And to keep that in mind, typically in any conflict, about 7% in the past century, about 7% of the deaths have been those of children. And when you compare that to Gaza, 42% have been children. So it's a very dire situation. It's a really large number of kids who are being killed, and not to mention the psychological impacts on the kids who are still alive, who have had to deal with parents being killed, siblings being killed, and other family members and friends. And again, speaking to the severity of the situation, the number of children killed in Gaza is equal to the number of children killed over 12 years of war in Syria. So keep in mind that it hasn't even been 4 months, and the numbers have totaled that of 12 years of war. And about an average of 160 children are killed per day. And like I mentioned, this is somewhat related to psychological impacts on children who are still alive. There has been a designation made in Gaza of WCNSF, which means Wounded Child No Surviving Family. And these are children where all their families have died and they have nobody left. And these are about 600 families where all the members have been killed. And in terms of injuries, about 700 to 900 children have had their limbs amputated. So these are very high and very dire numbers, speaking to how bad the situation is. And these are kids who are going to live with these problems for the rest of their lives. So next thing we're going to go is the impacts on women. So about 493,000 women and girls in Gaza have been forced out of their homes. And not only that, but there's also been the detention of women and girls from the Gaza ground invasion. And their locations have not been given to their families. So these people are kind of disappearing without anyone really knowing where they're going. And the Palestinian Authority's Commission of Detainees and Ex-Detainees Affairs confirmed that 142 females, including senior women and infants, are currently being held in Israeli jails. And when it comes to women in Gaza dealing with feminine hygiene care, many of them are taking tablets to avoid discomfort and pain during menstruation. And in addition to that, it's very difficult to find hygiene products to deal with menstruation. So this is a very bad situation hygienically. And obviously there's, not only these issues that aren't only for menstruation, but people are dealing with all kinds of diseases spreading around due to being unable to even bathe or shower. But I'll discuss more on that later. Back to the impacts on women. There are women who are undergoing C-sections without anesthesia due to the lack of access to anesthesia in Gaza right now. And we're talking about, this is a surgery that is known to be really painful, even under anesthesia, and takes a really long recovery time. So imagine, cutting through 7 layers of like skin tissue to get that surgery while being awake and aware of what's happening. And about 180 women are giving birth daily, and 15% are experiencing complications. And there is a lack of emergency OB services, which again, this is an issue because, giving birth in that situation and then having to deal with, dealing with a war while giving birth is extremely traumatic. And last but not least, there is eyewitness testimony on women in Gaza being rounded up and abducted and threatened with sexual violence. And this is a tactic that has been used over and over again by Israel, but it's just become a lot more common recently. So moving on, I also want to talk about the impacts on the healthcare sector. Most of Gaza's hospitals have been bombed, and some notable ones include Al Shifa Hospital, which I'm sure many of you have heard about because it's been all over the news. There's only a ratio of 1.55 hospital beds for every 1,000 people right now. And in a place where they're being bombed every single day and where there is a lot of malnutrition due to starvation and the collapse of the food sector, and as well as also disease spreading around, this is really bad. So people aren't getting the care that they need. And right now, the only hospital offering cancer treatments in Gaza has also gone out of order. And like I said, there are doctors performing surgery and amputations without anesthesia. And if any of you are on social media, you may have seen some of the videos. They're very horrific. But there are people who die from the pain and shock of having to go through these amputations without anesthesia. So just having anesthesia could have prevented many deaths. So moving on to the impact on schools. Well, actually, I did also want to discuss the healthcare, about 600 attacks on healthcare in Gaza and the West Bank since the war began. And this article, we can send it out to you all. But again, the situation is really bad in terms of healthcare. And again, also really bad in terms of education. So there's about 625,000 students who are unable to go to school right now. And as of mid-December, 352 school buildings have been damaged, which is more than 70% of Gaza's education infrastructure. And many of you know that people in Gaza have been sheltering in UN schools. These are supposed to be safe zones as designated by the UN, but there have been many reports of Israel targeting these schools and killing people inside. So no matter where you go, even if it's meant to be someplace that's safe, people are still being targeted, and there's no actual space for people to get to be able to go inside a place that's deemed safe. So moving on to the impact on the press and media. This is designated as the deadliest conflict for journalists. It has the highest number of journalist casualties in a short period of time. Many of you may have heard of Chief Al Jazeera correspondent Wa'il al-Dahdouh's son, who was killed a few days ago, along with another freelance journalist named Mustafa Thuraya. So these are some of the notable names that have been killed, as well as Samir Abu Daqqa and Saida Tawila for Al-Khamsa News. So these are some very high-profile journalists being targeted and being killed. You may also have heard of Mu'taz Aziza. He has mentioned that there were many times where he was shot at by snipers, and he believes it to be targeted. So this is a really deadly conflict for journalists. It's a really bad situation for journalists. And there are reports that there's at least 100 journalists who have been killed since October 7th. So usually in a war, any type of war or any type of, crisis like this, people with press vests are supposed to be safe. That's why they wear the vest. But there are journalists who are being deliberately targeted in this conflict. So yes, thank you, Dr. Farah. So he clarified about the 625,000. That's you're right, that is in the Gaza Strip only. There are also tens of thousands of children in the West Bank who are also unable to attend schools. So that just shows like the gravity of the situation. So next I'm going to talk about the impact on places of worship. So 66 mosques in Gaza have been completely destroyed, and 146 have been partially damaged. And on October 20th, there was an attack on the Church of St. Porphyrius, which is a Greek Orthodox church. It's actually the largest Greek Orthodox church in Gaza. And it is a church where people were seeking shelter, and 20 Palestinians were killed and many others injured in that church bombing. So again, these places of worship are being targeted. These are places that are meant to be safe, where people should be able to worship and shelter, but that safety is not being provided to Gazans. So next I'm going to talk about the impacts on food. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but again, the situation is very dire. So there is a report of 202 million people in Gaza who are surviving on nothing. And these people are going without meals because of Israel's declared policy and not as a byproduct of the war. There's deliberate denial of food entry into Gaza. As many of you have heard, the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, it's very difficult to get aid in, and some of that aid includes food. And even when it does come in, there have been reports of people who live in Gaza who have to give over really large amounts of money to access that food that is coming in through the aid trucks, and most people are unable to afford it. So the last functioning bakery in Gaza was destroyed on November 16th, and the last functioning flour mill also closed. It's been reported that 9 out of 10 households in northern Gaza and 2/3 of the households in southern Gaza spent at least one full day and night without food. And at least 576,600 people have exhausted food supplies and face hunger and starvation. So just think about these numbers. There are reports, and I've seen them on social media, of many people who have been fasting because there's no other way to conserve the food and make sure that, they take it when they're on the brink of starvation. And many people have large families. So trying to feed all these children and trying to find the money to even buy the food that should be coming in through aid trucks is really hard for people. In terms of water, a well and main water tank that's used by over 70,000 people in northern Gaza was destroyed. And last but not least, 22% of agricultural farmland was destroyed by Israel since the start of the war. So this isn't just something that's going to be temporary, but the destruction of the agricultural farmland is going to ensure that starvation and food shortages are going to be an issue in Gaza for many years to come. So that kind of concludes my overview of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Obviously, this